thank you all for joining us. We're really, really excited to get the band together again. We're not putting out an LP or a CD, but just having this space to speak and chat is wonderful. Just to sort of recap, the thinking behind getting this project and this group together in the first place was we were really keen to, have a conversation about particular themes that animated this idea of platform futures with a particular focus on the Asia Pacific region. We wanted to think about the global nature of platforms, to what extent local context mattered, to what extent consistency on a global level was valuable versus something that was hyper-local and contextual, and localized rules that were driving platform governance. We were also really keen to look at why platforms were growing in scope and in scale, and what were the tools or levers that could allow for great competition amongst and between them, with the user very central to this question. How could this benefit end users? How could more choice be provided? And I think this sounds like a very basic question, but it's not solved, so we still need to keep talking about this. It was the idea of how can we optimize for all the social good and benefits that come out of platforms versus mitigating for harms, abuse, potential violations, weaponization, and disenfranchisement along various lenses and axes. So I think that was just the background and the context to this entire project. And we're really interested in very future-oriented questions and discussions. It doesn't matter if those are not physically possible or legally even sort of a glimpse in the eye of a policymaker, but to sort of look ahead and see where are the big battlegrounds, what are the issues that will animate this landscape, what do we think it will look like in a few years, what are the skills we might need to survive for platforms to be tenable and equitable. So that's just a very quick sort of canter through what we were interested in. So the way this will work is we've got 6 wonderful experts from our network and 1 invited guest who are going to just respond to a few questions. It's sort of it's a Q&A/conversation, just to throw out some provocations, to give you some scaffolding on which to hang your insights. And then we'll switch in part 2 to the Small Books for Big Platforms series that Nishant will guide us through. We'll have the authors of a few papers talk us through the insights from their research. So that's just the quick run through of the event. So I'm going to turn first to Julian and ask you, Julian, you have a lot of really interesting insights about the emergence of tech platforms and this idea of history, right, playing a role in this, about the long-term backstories behind the emergence of digital platforms. You've looked at it across different areas: mapping, navigation, books, video distribution. Maybe you could just talk us through what you think of as the conditions or the environment for success. Where do they succeed? Where do they fail? Thanks.
Thank you. And look, thanks very much for the chance to talk about this area. It's I think it's just a great time to have these conversations. And I don't really mean to start a discussion about the futures of platforms by obsessing about their past, but I think, as is so often the case, that there's a great deal to be understood about where platforms are going from a historical analysis. I think we can talk about what some people have called the deep history of platforms, because if we think about what platforms do, there's a sort of strong argument emerging, I think, in the scholarship that what they do is they connect with, they extend, and they modify existing kinds of market structures. They replace and reconfigure markets. Julie Cohen talks about how they rematerialize markets. So they don't really enter markets. They create new rules for markets. And I think in lots of circumstances, you can see them playing a formalizing role. And I think if we understand that, especially, of course, in the context of our region and the economic and historical complexity that we deal with there. It does help a great deal to understand where they might be going. If we think of them as creating new layers of intermediation over and above existing social and economic relations, as Adrian Afik has said. To just mention a couple of examples, I suppose. Adrian, colleague at University of Queensland, and a terrific Indian scholar in this area, Vibod Parthasarathi, have written a lot about how 19th century emporiums foreshadow the evolution of the digital Indian platform economy, how emporia pioneered what was a new kind of retail space with multiple supply chains and a huge plethora of different kinds of retail products, how they pioneered branding, how they pioneered systems of discovery, analogous to the complex discovery modes that we find in existing digital platforms, showcasing the diversity of products and services, how they played a centralising role in those new urban landscapes for transport, for services, for entertainment and so on, how they provided a basis for the development of what became department stores where critical commercial innovations such as cashless transactions developed. So I think that gives us an example of this kind of rematerialisation that Julie Cohen was talking about. In relation to mapping, you can see a different kind of trajectory where that occurs on the basis of public sector innovations and governmental infrastructures. So the contemporary digital mapping platforms, which we're increasingly familiar with, can be seen as private market-driven inflections of what has been described as the cartographic project, that project that really gathers pace in the 19th century of nation states, a significantly longer standing project, which was all about defining territories, formalising and aggregating geospatial information into strongly branded authoritative systems. So all the hallmarks of contemporary platforms, but back some time, they were about mapping, in particular about mapping private property and assigning definitive plate names and place names and those kinds of things. So I think there's some of the ways in which you can explore those what I'm calling the deep history of platforms. And focusing on that question of materialization, you can, I think, sort of see where the key points of friction are likely to be. Where they succeed, it's where platforms are combining those institutional and commercial functions successfully. Platforms, of course, fail for innumerable reasons, but the mapping platforms, which we've been talking about a bit in particular, succeeded really because they had the enormous resources of colonial and then post-colonial states behind them. And I think where we see platforms succeed, it's often where you have these scalar disparities in size and scope, which really turn the competitive landscape upside down and do successfully create new market rules.
Thank you, Julian. I think this sort of idea of bringing in markets and the sort of commercial interests, but also competing interests, so sort of competition in both senses, I think leads us up very nicely to something that I think Helani would be great at coming in on. She's really interested in the idea of market dynamics, but I think particularly this idea of points of friction, right? If you look at device manufacturers, through whom we experience a lot of these platforms on the one hand, and the end users on the other. Where would you, Helani, say there are points of friction in this landscape? And what do you think policymakers and regulators can do to actually tackle or address or work around some of these conflicting interests or competing interests?
Thanks, Malavika. So, I mean, if you look at the value chain of, let's say, our end device is a mobile phone, there could be, that in itself is a platform of sorts, but there are other more obvious platforms like the, Google Play or the app stores. Within those live the Amazon's, Facebook, or any of those things, which you can also separately download if you want, which are platforms themselves. Then there are sellers, buyers, consumers, and other service providers, right? So throughout all of this is the imbalance of information, asymmetric information, and therefore the power that emanates from it is how we see it, right? So at one end, the consumer certainly now, particularly on transaction and selling platforms, has more information than they would have otherwise because they can price compare. So there is increased power, definitely, but in comparison to who? The seller has generally lower entry costs with many of these platforms if you want to sell, but there are entry costs. You can't automatically switch. The platform itself has a lot more information, and this has been theorized well about the meta information about user behavior, or what kind of products they search for, and so on. The platform owns it. The individual producer does not know that Helani from Sri Lanka is using for pink widgets, right? Until that transaction goes through. So there's a lot of meta information about user behavior, which can be quite separated from the product pricing and confidential product related information, right? So, but even that part of that information doesn't actually flow to other people. So there's a fundamental problem. And this comes out in regulatory responses because, there's evidence about Amazon sort of, driving people out of the market because they have more information about pink widgets than the actual pink information owner, right? Widget owner. So there's huge asymmetries of information. So underlying this are sort of, if you go to economic concepts for the consumer, the power relationship is about switching costs. So if you look at a work platform, I work on Fiverr.com, let's say, doing logos, and we study these people. They can't exactly port their previous work done on the platform to another one. So portability or switching costs becomes a really important concept that we haven't really addressed. That happens across content platforms. So at the operational end, that's about interoperability, but from the consumer end, that's about portability, right? So metadata and portability. So in the regulatory response, I think certainly the American-driven response, the primacy is given to short and medium-term drops in prices and increases in choice, which platforms have brought about, right? And yet the longer term impacts on who is able to enter markets and whether there's a level playing field for somebody who doesn't have the existing network effects and huge venture capital backing that's now required to really provide meaningful competition in a platform, that gets sort of, ignored. So I would say the regulatory response really has to worry about very practical stuff like portability, interoperability, the sharing of metadata. So I'll really differentiate that from product data, but the long-term competitive dynamics.
Thank you, Helani. I think that whole sort of description of the supply chain and the key critical point about asymmetry, both of information, but which really is power as well and choice, is super important in this space. And I think, as you said, it's sort of interoperability on one side and portability on the other. And it's something that regulators have tried to sort of artificially nudge or push platforms and providers to do with sort of varying degrees of success. And I think if I could bring in Yong Lim here to talk a little bit further about the sort of market dynamics and business models that you observe as someone who's, competition antitrust lawyer, and maybe think a little bit about the factors that boost competition or that inhibit competition, and that, ultimately with the end user goal of autonomy and choice. If you could just talk us through maybe some of the models, the approaches that you come across. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Malavika, for inviting me today. I really liked what Julian and Helani just mentioned, and so maybe I'll try to build on what they just said. I think it's really important when we talk about platforms to remember that we're probably talking about many different things at the same time. So, and particularly that the concept of platform is evolving. And I think maybe Julian would probably be more of the expert on this, but as I have observed, till now, even in currently debated legislation, often platforms are defined based on their function as an intermediary. So intermediation, network effects, and these are sort of the core concepts. But I think nowadays it's probably better to talk about platforms in at least some sense as spheres of consumption that provide tailored, speedy, and even predictive gratification of individual preferences using data processing algorithms. And so you can talk about spheres as gardens or ecosystems, but I think that's probably a more accurate description of what is going on in the market right now. And so when you talk about these ecosystems at that level, now what we've seen in the market emerge is competition between conglomerate-like multifaceted ecosystems that compete with one another on multiple fronts, obviously amongst each other with different core competencies. So to a certain extent, it's true that Amazon competes with Facebook, Facebook with Microsoft, Microsoft with Apple. And so, there's these platform level competition. And then there's also a competition within these ecosystems between the platform and the firms that populate their platforms, the garden, and also among those firms themselves. And I think the emergence of these popular ecosystems, or some people call them digital conglomerates, has actually created complications for competition policy. So prior to the emergence of these large, you might say big tech or platforms, we generally tended to define competition for the market, so competition to be the platform, and then competition on the platform or within the platform, so follow-on competition. And competition policy has always focused primarily or more on competition for the platform. And so you see the discussion among different policymakers about how are we going to create the next Apple, the next Google, ensure that Facebook has competitors, etc. But this ecosystem competition actually complicates the picture and actually makes competition within these ecosystems as important as competition for or competition to be the platform. And so there lies the difficulty. And so you see, I think, the EU DMA, DSA response of really focusing on competition within these different gardens, although I do have some doubts on whether and how effective those proposals will be. Malavika, to answer directly about what factors boost or inhibit competition, I think maybe as Helani has already pointed out, the important thing is access and control of data. So who has and how much control or access is given to each party. And I'm not really focusing on data portability in the sense of end users or individuals exercising those data sovereignty rights, but I think it's more so or more pertinent that we talk about access and control of data by businesses or the firms that populate these different platforms, just like Helani said about meta data being very important. The next point of really factor would be access to users or trying to get access to users. And so there you have worries about these big platforms, or at least these big managers of these gardens or ecosystems acting as a bottleneck, and especially when they have their own services. And so talk about self-preferencing does allude to this problem. So both of these access points are going to be critical. How those access points are, or why broaden, or where and how they occur, I think will be critical to competition going ahead when we talk about platforms in the market.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really great sort of canter through the sort of dynamics at play. And if I could ask you just a very, very quick follow-up before I turn to Helani and Julian again, is, are there tools in the toolbox that you think help the little players in this sort of ecosystem? Because if data and the ability to collect it resides more naturally with the big platforms and it comes with scale, how do little guys either enter the market, the sort of competition for platforms, as well as the other dynamics that help them thrive once they're part of an existing platform? Thank you.
So let me make 2 points here. So the first, I think, important point to keep in mind is that there is not going to be a general remedy or antidote that works for platforms in general. So again, we're talking about numerous business models, different sectors, different points and types of gardens or ecosystems. And so trying to find a sort of silver bullet here is not going to work. Now, line of business restrictions are widely cited and considered, I think, more these days. I think it stems from the telecommunications or sectoral regulation experience in the past, and these LOBRs have worked to a certain degree there, and so people are thinking about, well, why don't we try it with digital platforms? I do have some doubts of whether that not only would that be effective, but actually beneficial to the consumer, because at the end of the day, what consumers want are these gardens. Now, what we would like to have is multiple sets of gardens. Some may have high walls and some may have low walls. And it's not so much a matter of the height of the wall, but are there portholes that you can enter and come into the garden more easily? I think that's where we want to really focus. So trying to restrict the scope of business of these big platforms under line of business restrictions, I don't think would really work well. It actually goes against how the market is evolving at this time. And even little guys, they want to have their own sort of gardens, or they want to create their own ecosystems. And I don't think LOBRs are the answer. So Helani talked about interoperability. That's a good remedy. That could be a good remedy for social networking services or in that sector. So again, by sector, there will be different remedies that may be more effective than others. The second point that I would like to make is we have to be very careful when we broadly promulgate platform rules or regulations in this sector. And so I would like to maybe take the example of the European approach of the Digital Markets Act, et cetera. It does focus, I think, rightly on competition within platforms, on those platforms, and they're trying to really make things more fair in a certain sense. And that does have some meaning now. It's not really before antitrust had a disliking of what we would call fairness, but I think now people are coming around more to the idea that there is something to be said about fair competition. That being said, what I worry is that devices like DMA, those regulations, could in fact ossify the current competitive state and actually make it more difficult for entrants to come in. Now, you might think that, well, the DMA only targets big platforms, so the little guys can come in. That's not actually always the case. Because of those restrictions, these platforms are going to now promulgate certain rules and within those gardens that may not be beneficial, but actually forced by the regulator towards different firms within those platforms. So I'm not really sure if these currently considered remedies would always work very well. So I think that's something that we have to have also in mind when we talk about competition or fostering competition in this sphere.
Thank you so much. I love your very visual metaphors. Like, I'm walking away from hearing you with ideas of spheres and different kinds of gardens and walls, and it's super helpful, right? Especially if we're trying to get some of these ideas across to a lay audience or a less expert academic audience. I think this is really, really helpful. And I think if I stick with that sort of metaphor of frame and go back to Helani, I know with a lot of the empirical work that you've done in the global south and in emerging economies, or whatever the latest politically correct term is that we're supposed to use for a lot of this, I know you're particularly interested in users and choice and autonomy in the global south and what the particular barriers might be for them, and how we could lower those. And I think, again, to Yong's point, that we can't have a one-size-fits-all or a silver bullet. Are there particular remedies or tools that you think show promise in emerging economies?
So I think, again, overall, the barriers for using and benefiting and being on platforms really varies by platform, but there's one sort of common theme before from a consumer point of view, and that is you need a mobile phone. So obviously we start with the huge disparity in access, right? So we're talking sort of most of the South Asian countries, perhaps with the exception of Nepal, under 50% of people over the age of 15. I mean, as low as 30, as low as 20 in some countries. The numbers have bumped up due to COVID. Having a feature phone or a smartphone that gives a decent mobile internet experience, having very low quality data connectivity because the networks are loaded, low digital literacy on average. Under 40% of people say they can do anything other than passive browsing. So changing privacy settings, posting information, searching, doing a transaction are beyond the capabilities. All of this comes with huge gender gaps and slightly less but significant urban-rural gaps and income. So the rich, if you are female and rural, you're less likely to be online and so on. So that's the first barrier, right? That's from just a consumption point of view. Then if you are a producer of services, so you want to be a Uber driver, you want to do your logos online and sell them on Upwork.com or whatever, then there's a whole set of other barriers, such as inability to get paid because countries are still blocking. Sri Lanka is a classic example, PayPal. So you have to now have the technical skills to pretend and morph an IP address in Malaysia, open a PayPal account pretending you're a Malaysian person, get paid into that. You can't cash out in Sri Lanka. You can only sort of circulate that money to buy more things that you might need, like mobile phones and so on, and pay for it, but you can't really access the cash. Or you end up paying, 14 up to 30% into intermediaries who help you cash out through various cards. Those are real problems, right? So very low use of credit cards. That's another barrier, both on the ability to receive money and then pay for transactions. So these are quite significant. Yeah, I'll just stop there just to sort of give a flavor of the kind of barriers. Those are transaction platforms. And my last point is about content platforms, which are sort of the classic Twitters and Facebook. Again, developing countries and consumers, or even the platform operators, really have significant problems. One would be the lack of language resources. And, this comes very personally from our work. If you're thinking about the platform's responsibility of moderating content of, let's say, Bengali language users, it's severely under-resourced compared to English or French. The language corpuses do not exist. So given the large amount of content that's being generated, human moderation, first-level human moderation is not possible. You actually need AI tools and so on, but you can't run natural language processing algorithms when the rules of the language are not codified. So there's a really basic African languages and so on resource problem where the linguists, the computational scientists, the machine learning people have to come together and create the rules so we can do the first level of analysis. So there's lots of sort of structural imbalances in the way people from the global south, maybe that's another term we call the politically correct term, from the global south, enter, transact, purchase, and sell on these platforms.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helani. And I think that actually sets us up really, really well for Siddharth, who's done so much work on language and speech and hate speech in particular. I think, we've been talking about buying, selling, participation, economic rights to some extent. And I think maybe if we switch a little bit to Siddharth to talk more about how platforms actually seek to regulate content and what they can do when it comes to incitement to violence and some of the other work that you've done, Siddharth, in this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Malavika. So I think the question of platforms moderating, one part of it is their ability to moderate and their expertise and the investment that they put in. But the other part of it is also increasing political contestations over platform moderation. So for instance, increasingly, especially when it comes to the question of incitement in relation to network publics and crowd violence, we're seeing increasing contestations of what incitement actually means. So on the one hand, you have global standards, you have, international legal standards around hate speech and incitement, which platforms work with. They don't work with them formally, but they draw upon them to frame their community guidelines and community standards. But what happens is these work in conjunction with local laws. So platforms regulate at two levels, right? So they're moderating content both on their platforms, which they can be proactive about, but they also have to enforce local laws in countries. So there's this kind of constant tension that's playing out. And increasingly what we see is contestations of what actually constitutes incitement. So for instance, terms like insurrection or rebellion or protest, collective forms of action in the contemporary world, whether it is the storming of the White House, the Congress, the US, or whether it is debates over farmers' protests in India, you see state intervention which try to frame them in a particular way. And platforms, which were earlier trying to remain slightly more, say, they're intermediaries, they don't take, that they were neutral from these issues, somehow one step, a step aside. Here now they're increasingly being forced to actually take positions. So they have to do things like label content, or actually get people off platforms, or warning and give warnings. So this is what increasingly that we see, right? Whether it's on Twitter or whether it's on Facebook. So here we have platforms who are increasingly implicated in the way that this issue, what actually constitutes incitement, what actually constitutes hate speech. So I think there is something that's changing in that. And this also changes as both civil society and states put pressure on platforms. So, for instance, in India now you have a huge pressure on WhatsApp to trace the originator of messages so that the government can prosecute. You have pressure on platforms to constitute local branches, local offices through legislation. This is pressure being put so that they have local offices being set up so that the police officer can go and knock on their doors if needed physically, that it's not something that's outside their jurisdiction. And how do platforms then respond to this? So on the one hand, you have their actual commercial interests in being in these parts, especially parts of the global south where there are lots of users. But on the other hand, you also have their practices and precedents being set, which could impact their global rules. Right. So this is one, I think, speaking to what you were asking.
Thank you. I think this idea of the local versus the sort of broad international standards is something that Nighat actually is dealing with very intimately, because she's a member of the Facebook Oversight Board, which is sort of this new experiment in platform governance. And I know it brings together a mix of people with different backgrounds and different regional perspectives. But I wonder, Nighat, if you would like to sort of build on Siddharth's point about this point of friction or this negotiation between the global and the local, and the way it plays out with your new role, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you, Malavika. So I think it's important to mention that the independent oversight board is an experiment, and I think it'll be quite early to predict anything in terms of how this experiment will play out in the next couple of years. But I guess but also I think it's important to mention that there is a charter under which the board sort of plays its role. We have a scope in terms of content moderation and what kind of appeals we can look into. And local laws will supersede, against our charter. So in that sense, we have limitations for any, appeal that comes to us, which is basically, on the request of a government under a local law, the takedown or leave up, we technically cannot look into this. But I would also say that I think we have issued some decisions in the past. For instance, while Siddharth was talking about, the Indian example, the board gave a decision on one case around religious minorities in India, and questions Facebook's own, decision-making policy in terms of, even if it's not AI, if it's human, moderators looking into the content and deciding how they are looking into, such kind of requests of takedown. So there are like number of recommendations that we gave in that decision with regards to religious minorities, with regards to languages. Language was the main recommendation in the case decision. So I think it's really important now, removing my hat of oversight board member and as a digital rights activist, what basically Siddharth said really, it sort of resonated to me, because that's the same challenge that we are also facing in country like Pakistan. And the kind of, the urge of the government to make regulations in the name of online harms rules or social media rules, and now pushing tech giants to, abide by the local laws, which are already, by the way, problematic. I mean, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act in Pakistan, which was enacted in 2016, is a really problematic law. And now they are coming up with new laws to regulate not just, the tech giants, but also, the other platforms that Helani mentioned, and digital media organizations as well. So I think there is this sort of challenge that at the local level, organizations are resisting against this trend and pattern by the government. But I feel that this is like a really complex issues where, not just the civil society organizations or activists like us really need to resist such kind of regulations, but at the same time, I think tech giants and companies need to take a position, while keeping in mind the global standard of international human rights framework in terms of how they will respond to the governments when they will come up with such local laws and challenge, companies in terms of content moderation.
Thank you, Nighat. If I could just ask you a very quick follow-up, which is that from this work you've mentioned, both in both the roles that you've talked about, are there particular features or ingredients for effective oversight that you would recommend to policymakers, like not just in the Facebook arena, but more broadly, are there good ingredients?
Yeah. So Malavika, I think one of the motivation of me joining the board was to bring, a certain set of issues that I, in my digital rights activist, under the digital rights activist hat, has been raising for a decade. And those certain points when it comes to content moderation, I believe, context, these companies, whether they are tech giants, whether we are talking about other businesses, really, need to look into the context. I think we are at a point where we cannot really, look into the global standards which fits for all, one size fits for all. I don't think that's going to work for all jurisdictions. Language is something that they really need to look into. Local expert knowledge, like people sitting in these companies, when they are designing products, when they are designing policies, who are these people? Do they have this local knowledge or knowledge about the context? Are they putting enough resources in terms of, training their AIs? If like as Helani said, that human moderation is something that you really need like a lot of resources, and there are limitations around scalability. So are you putting resources in terms of training your AI? So, AI biases, but then, AI that you have trained 3 years ago, like what about, what about those automation tools? And I think one thing that I have also noticed in my role as an oversight board member, people don't know about these community guidelines. People don't know about policies of these platforms. And when they, their content is taken down or their content has left up, they have no idea under what policy certain platform has done that. And I think it's because the arbitrary nature of decisions that these platforms have been taking in the past. We have seen in the region also that it's not always looking into the community guidelines and policies. It's also, like the staff of these technology platforms. So I think it's very important to see how people should know about the community guidelines. And I think when there is a mass awareness raising, then automatically stakeholders will give their feedback that, all right, this policy is not working. Your policy around dangerous organizations and individuals is not working for our region. So what kind of change, the platforms really need to look into when it comes to improving their community guidelines, when it comes to training their AIs, and also, important for them, like for every platform, to look beyond global norm, and have a conversation with proper people from global south. I mean, problematic term, but at the same time, global south, and consult with the people with actual knowledge of the local context.
Thanks so much, Nighat. Siddharth, if I can very quickly push you on one point before handing over to Kingwa to take us in sort of a different direction, is given all that Nighat was saying, are there particular battlegrounds that you're concerned about? Do you think this sort of debate or this sort of landscape is going to evolve in particular directions? What are you worried about in this space?
So one direction, I think, in the light of what Nighat is saying, is one direction clearly is the constitutionalization of platform moderation. So this idea that the arbitrariness of platforms taking these decisions should be checked by an independent body that's set up outside of their control, and that these will then set up norms which will act as some sort of precedent. And so, of course, this particular Facebook Oversight Board is an experiment in that direction. But I think that is going to be one kind of a crucial kind of direction in which many platforms might take this issue. And the other one is, of course, increasingly platforms are reaching out to experts from various regions of the world in order to tailor make some of their guidelines and policies and move away from a more First Amendment, US-based First Amendment idea of, say, speech or other issues, to move away from that to something that's more located within other contexts. And you can see that happening on issues like hate speech and incitement and so on. You can actually see it happening as they keep changing their guidelines constantly, which happens on almost on a constant basis based on these processes that they've set up.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point at which to think about not just the social, the political, and sort of the economic ideas we've been discussing, but I think we've talked about next generations and future-looking things, and I think young people are a very huge part of this landscape, right? And they're often used as a proxy to say, oh, young people don't care about privacy, so we can carry on, or it's certain values of the internet are anachronistic. They don't work for young people, and the way they use media is different. The way they engage with platforms or obfuscate their digital trails is different. And I wonder, Kinghua, you've done a lot of really interesting empirical work on how the youth engage with media and with platforms in Asia, and especially forms of diffusion, how information gets diffused in different contexts. And I wonder if you could share with us some of the findings from your research around how many of these memes and ideas get propagated and shared more widely.
Thanks for having me, Marika. So about a question about the use of platform and how young age people are concerned about their use as well as the privacy. Let me just give you an example first to discuss about the how the interaction between the platform and the user in the context of the Hong Kong social movement in 2019. So when a protest, a lot of protests basically were organized by the Hong Kong peoples in 2019 without a central organizations to organize the protest. And majority of them basically were organized by normal people to use their mobile device to share information, to mobilize people to join the protest, to design a poster to draw people attention, to update their geolocation and share with the other protest activists in the site. And even some of the people used the instant survey to collect different views to inform the next step, the decision making during the protest. So that is all some of the examples that I think definitely we can see around the world. The people, especially younger age people, who are a bit heavy user of the mobile device. Basically in Hong Kong, 100% of people have mobile device. They use them in the protest. And basically, I would argue that a lot of the protest was enabled by the use of technology. But back to the question that you mentioned about the concern about privacy issue by the younger age people. So I would argue that that really depends on the context and under which circumstances we consider. There's also related to the interaction between the state platform as well as the user. Let me give an example also in the Hong Kong context. When we observe that the use of an organization of protest were largely done on internet, on the mobile device, on some of the platforms. So it's also collect large number of digital trace data. So it's also alert the Hong Kong people to pay attention to what data the platform collect during the process, and also what kinds of information they want to share and what kind of security level the platform provide. Let me give you an example. Before the protest in 2019, majority of Hong Kong citizens used a private messaging system like WhatsApp. But during the social movement, a lot of people perceive that because of the background of the WhatsApp basically tied with the large company Facebook, they thought that perhaps they may move to another more secure platform. That's why they used extensively Telegram as the major platform during the social movement. But at the same time, as I just mentioned, because a lot of the digital trace data was collected, as also collected by the police. So a lot of the police basically make use of the Telegram data to prosecute protesters doing in many court cases. So this makes a lot of people last year, after the introduction of the national security law, a lot of people migrate to another platform, which is Signal, that also considered to be even more secure. So that also showcased a lot of people, including younger age people in Hong Kong, basically concerned a lot about the privacy issue, especially under the context of this kinds of authoritarian control, as well as digital governance issues. So that back to the question, the digital platform basically provides the enabling power, but also can provide this kind of suppressive ability.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear about the social movements shaping how people move between platforms or use or reject some of them. As someone who's lived in Hong Kong, it particularly resonated for me. And a quick follow-up for you, Kenghua, is, do you think, I mean, you've talked about political and social movements. Are you seeing other shifts that have been accelerated because of COVID, either in the education space or other ways in which platforms and their affordances are being recalibrated or used in different ways? Any interesting insights there?
Okay, so one of the observation I would say is it's an even more dynamic and contingent interaction between state, platform, and user agents in this really dynamic and emergent environment. So you mentioned about COVID. So I think one of the excellent example is the use of mobile or digital devices for education purposes, for e-learning. So we all understand a lot of people basically, like right now we are doing, is using Zoom as one of the major platforms to deliver lectures to do all kinds of education, a lecture, and play a lesson on Zoom. But at least in Hong Kong, a lot of school before 2020 basically had no idea what was Zoom. They did not have the license. They did not know what exact it about. So that at this very short period of time, because of some kinds of decision, basically Zoom was considered as the mainstream of the learning platform used by different kinds of school or university, that all the people migrate to Zoom. And also people start to learn about all kind of practice, how to negotiate the platform, how to change the background, just like what we did hours ago. So we need to adopt to the new platform in a pretty short period of time, and then we move to the other. And also they're very difficult to people to change at the same time, even though some of the concern about some of the security or privacy concern raised last year, but it also had some kinds of implication about what kinds of platform and interaction with the user, and also what the government tried to push for the use of what kind of platform for just like education purpose. We can't afford to have multiple platforms at the same time, but that's why this is also the state decision to try to push for in terms of the education policy.
Thank you so much, Kingwa. I'm going to ask Helani and Yong a very quick one sentence closing remark, which is for Yong. I would really love to understand what's the consumer's role in facilitating competition, if any. And for Helani, I think I'd really like to ask, what is there anything that you think is missing when it comes to regulation? Any sort of wish list that you have? So maybe Yong first.
Sure. So in the digital era, I think digital literacy, perhaps even AI literacy, will be very important. So I think education is something that we really have to think about when we talk about competition policy and consumer protection. I'll leave you with an observation that was very interesting to me. So till now, we think about users or end users, consumers in the digital era as subjects, data subjects who may or may not consent to data being collected, or who could be potentially manipulated through different choices that are just given to them. And then they select one or more. But in fact, one noticeable trend coming out in the e-commerce sector in Korea is that now consumers are actively utilizing algorithms to obtain better deals. So they educate the algorithms. So sometimes they will purposefully put in certain words, or they will take certain actions. And so they are starting to engage with these algorithms. So I think rethinking the role of consumers will be very important while boosting their literacy. And I think then we can really think about or really expect consumers to play a more positive role when it comes to competition.
I love that so much. I think Helani's also been smiling while you've been talking, because I know we're all big fans of resisting and subverting systems wherever possible, and power to the little people. So I think hacking and working around and using these tools in your own favor rather than to privilege platform power is really fascinating. Helani, what's missing?
I think, obviously there's a whole lot of things we've talked about, like data protection laws, just competition policy, etc. I think the fundamental problem is that, if you look at mergers, acquisitions, how we think about it, we think, the big question is, what is the market? And Yong got into that, I think, in his earlier comments. We think the market is pink widgets or your SMS. In fact, the market is information, and we haven't been able to define that across platforms of the transactional type, the content type, and all of these types, right? So there's some theoretical work being done, but we're really bad at defining what that informational market is, and we are very bad at valuing it, right? the valuations are completely off. So there's theoretical work, and then you need to incorporate that into actual regulatory decisions when it particularly comes into vertical players buying each other, or horizontal integration also. Yeah.
And I think that is a great clarion call for more research in this space, which is exactly what Nishant is going to take us through, the production of papers in this space, but also I will leave Nishant actually to spell out the work that we've been doing with the Small Books for Big Platforms. But thank you all to the panelists who've shared so generously and with such interesting insights. And thank you again, and I'll hand over to Nishant for part 2.